Welcome. So today we're going to talk about creating a budget. Up to now we've really discussed how to estimate costs of all sorts of things, from labor to some materials to software, incorporating learning curves, all those types of things. But what do we do with all that information? We at some point need to collect all that information, compile it in a way that's understandable for somebody else to understand what we call a full budget. This is true for any projects, businesses that you're trying to pitch on business plans. You need to have these types of things together. Okay, so what does that really mean? The budget itself is a plan. It's a plan for how are you allocating funds, how are you allocating money. Also, how are you allocating different resources and toward what ends. What schedule are you going to try to follow lines up with that? And we talked about schedules before. It can be top-down, management-driven. It could be bottom-up, which is kind of what we've been really talking about from the work breakdown structure. What we're really trying to get to, though, is what we call activity-based costing. So we put all these things together. We had our work breakdown structure, our schedule. Budgeting is the last kind of piece in the hopper that we need to get so that we can spit out a well-planned project. And so the budget goes as a fundamental part of that. Activity-based costing, or the ABCs, is really encapsulating that bottom-up approach so that we can compile everything together into one cohesive budget. Several things have to happen. When we look at all the different activities and all the resources for each activity, all those have to be identified, and we have to have some estimation of how long it's going to take for each of those. That's why it's important to look at the cost, not only the cost, but the schedule, how much time it's going to take for people to do the work, because you can't estimate the cost for any activity until you know how much time each person's going to put into each activity. Then you got to know their rate and all those things. So there's the activities that use your resources, and you assign costs to these. So we'll assign a cost by activity as we go. We'll also look at what are the biggest cost drivers. Is it personnel? Is it our labor? Or is it materials? What is it in each activity that drives the cost? Then we can compute a cost rate. Then we can multiply cost driver times rate times, and the volume cost driver, whatever that is. Maybe it's $300 per unit times 100 units. That tells us how much that costs. So these are oftentimes called direct cost estimates. And we have to do this for every work package in our work breakdown structure. So we're just going to show a simplified model. So here's all the activities in our project. So in this case, we have a sample where we have to get permits, we have to do a survey of some land, maybe design whatever we're going to build there, clear the site, building foundation, framing, plumbing, and wiring. And that's where it's cut off before the next phase. So this activity has all these components to it. So this could be really subtasked to a larger task or a larger deliverable. We have our direct costs associated with each of these things. Again, these are estimates that you would get in the field. We have our overhead, and notice the overhead doesn't stay the same for everything. Now this is in absolute cost terms, or dollar terms, if we're talking United States dollars. Versus percentage terms, so it's not in percents. And so we just add those two together, first and second column, and that's how you get the total planned cost per activity. So if this whole thing was one project or just one deliverable made up of all these activities, that would cost us $38,800 or euros or whatever units we're working in. So this is one type of map you want to be able to make, at least on a deliverable basis. Another thing you can do then is you can expand that. In fact, I have a worksheet for you guys in the class, in the shell under Module 5, that you can download, and you can put in your own numbers. This one just happens to be the preview that I just showed you. And then you could use this as really kind of a dumbed down version of tracking, where you could say, okay, these are what we planned everything was going to be for activities, and here's what our actual costs were. So now you can compare your actual cost per activity based upon what you're really paying for and what it's really taking versus what you had planned for. And so when you take the actual minus the planned, you get a difference. If it's positive, that means you've gone over on your actuals by some. If it's negative, that means you've gone under budget by a little bit. Rarely you can get to a 0. It's pretty rare, but it does happen. And ultimately you can add up everything per deliverable or per activity and see the difference. So in this case, for the whole deliverable, we're about $900 over what we initially had planned. So that is a way you can just start to understand the tracking process. We're going to get far more into tracking later on in the second to last module. But this kind of gives you an idea of where that's going to go. The other thing we have to look at is what we call a time-phased budget. So a time-phased budget is where we map out not only the cost per activity, but when we're going to spend that money. Because remember, you don't always spend all the money for an activity in one shot. Sometimes it's spread out over time, as is the case here. So here, a common way to do this is to break it down into months, mostly for the point that most things are broken down into months from a cost perspective, particularly like leases, things like that. So it's easier to track. So let's say the permits, we can do all of that in the month of April, so we're going to spend all that money in April. That's our plan. Survey has to come after the permits. We'll spend all of our $3,800 in May. Design, however, it might take a little more time, so we'll spend the majority of our money in June. Then we're probably going to round it out with a little bit more money in July to finish up the design process. Site clearing, we can do that in a month. Foundation a month. Framing, plumbing, and wiring, that's going to take 2 months. So again, you notice how for framing it's front-loaded, most of the work's then and only a little bit more in September, or the other, it might be the other way around. Maybe it's a little bit in August and then really finishes out in September. So if you look at the total activity cost, that's really the sum of the values from, in this case, April through September across all the months. So you're summing left to right. Then the total activity costs still is again the sum down, which is the same thing we would expect, $38,800, because this is what we planned. Then our monthly plan, now we can break down how much money are we actually going to need to spend each month, because that changes now, because we may have more than one thing happening at the same time. So notice April, May doesn't really affect us, but man, in June, July, August, and September, we actually have more money being spent. So you notice in June we're spending $9,300. July we're spending $10,500. So our cash flow needs are going to be different during those months than say the month of April when it was only $1,700 in requirements. Then we also have a cumulative tracker on the bottom below that. So we started the first month, spent $1,700. It's $1,700. The next month though, we're going to add the amount that we're spending in May to the amount that we are spending in April. Then we get $5,500, and so on. Now, if you do it right, your final month of activity in a project on your cumulative, the $38,800 should actually match your total activity cost. Keep this in mind. You're going to want to make one of these structures again with your group project, but this will come back to play later on when we want to do tracking. So it's kind of important to understand that this is a stepping stone toward tracking. We're not there yet, but this is a piece so that you can understand how things are mapped out. How does it look like when we map it out with a graph? It looks like this. So if you notice, we have something that looks like what we call an S-curve. We start spending a little bit, then we start spending a lot, the curve gets steeper, and then we start tapering off again, up at the top. This graph in the last spreadsheet is also in the spreadsheet section in Module 5. So you have access to that, so you can play around and put in some numbers of your own. You can add as many activities as you want. Again, you'll have to modify the formulas a little bit, but you have a template there that you can pull from, so you don't have to make everything from scratch. Now, contingencies. We always need to have some contingencies. This is where we allocate some extra funds for uncertainty. Do we have uncertainty? Absolutely. Always. There's always going to be some risks of things that we don't know are going to come up or that happen. Of course, the closer we get to the end of a project, the better, because then it increases the odds that we're going to be done on time. Again, just like when we did a risk analysis. Our project scope may change. Again, that could be from the client or customer. Murphy's Law is present. That's kind of a frame of mind, not necessarily a reality. You think of what can go wrong, possibly could. That's a risk analysis. Cost estimation must anticipate interaction costs. And normal conditions are, quote unquote normal, are rarely encountered. Something happens. Somebody may slip and fall, like in the little icon here. And that throws things off for whatever reason. We had an apartment complex that was being built across the street years ago. And it was moving right along, humming along, and then all of a sudden plumbers were doing some sweating of some pipes and caught a spark, caught the dry timber, and the whole place went up. Burnt the whole place down. Huge fire. You bet that was not something they had planned on. And it's probably not something that even a contingency could take care of. That would have to deal with insurance. But still, again, things happen. So for the small contingencies, you can plan ahead for that. For other things, you might need insurance or larger risk plans. What's the benefits of contingency funding? Well, it puts in place that you've actually thought that there's going to be uncertainty, and so you've kind of planned for that. And so you have some provisions to handle that buffer, if you will, of funds that might be required. Contingency fund also acts as an early warning signal if we're potentially overdrawing a budget. So if we see us going over our planned budget and moving into our contingency funding, that should be an alarm to us. Say, hey, something's not quite right. We need to go back and look at what's going on and figure out why we're going over so much and understand why that is. So we need to make a budget estimate. I love this line. So it says, I need a budget estimate for my project, but I don't have a scope or design for it yet. Dilbert turns around and says, okay, my estimate's $3,583,729. But you don't know anything about my project. That makes two of us. So, again, you have to know what you're budgeting for and what is the scope, what are you designing. That's why breaking everything down into small tasks is so important. And building the budget from those small tasks, from those details, gives you a much better estimation of the overall project. What should we look like in the end? Well, this is a budget estimate / quote. So it's just a format. It's not the only format. It's similar to one they have in the book as well. By the way, I've put this spreadsheet as well as a model that you guys can play with in Module 5 as well. So have at it. And it has several things, place for the project name, whatever it is. And this could be at a whole project level. This could be at a specific activity level. So if you have a really involved project, maybe each task is going to require one of these things. That could be a process for very complex projects. Or maybe this is at a deliverable level. It really just depends upon the complexity of the project. So there's a group area for internal labor. This is like anybody who's involved in this project or activity or deliverable, whatever scale we're talking about. What skill set are they? Now this could be the title. Sometimes it's nice to put the skill set for what they're specifically doing because you may want to have different people doing different work. Category, this is just kind of an internal numbering system, not necessary. We have test engineer, senior test engineer, drafter, draft quality checker. Different amount of rates per hour, how many hours there are going to be on this particular deliverable activity or project, and those costs. So again, these are just basic costs. If you notice, this does not include the overhead on there. This is a little bit different because this is more like what accountants like to see. They like to see the direct separated out from the overhead. And a lot of customers like to see that. So it's a little bit different viewpoint than the previous versions of budgeting we looked at. We get a subtotal of hours and cost. We have a contingency percentage. What is that percent? What's appropriate? 5%? Is that good enough? 15%, 20%? That's a judgment call based upon the risks. In this case, we chose 10%. And so we have 10% of 165 is 17 hours, rounded to the hour. Same with 10% of $6,025, $602.50. Add those on, we get a total number of hours of 182 hours and $6,627.50. Then we multiply by the overhead, which doesn't go to the hours, it just goes to the cost. So that's another $3,313. We add that to the $6,627. We get almost 10 grand. Then we have fixed costs or bought out costs. We have some materials, some finished goods, a test cabinet. We're paying a CE test lab to do a test for us. There's also instrumentation, some analysis and report that we have to pay for, and we need to build a test fixture so that we can do these types of things. So this is really kind of an automated testing and certification type of model. So all those get added up. We get a subtotal of about 15 grand. Again, there's a contingency here that's different. Notice that doesn't have to have the same contingency percentage. In this case, it's 15%. You add that up, add that to it. Then we have other indirect expenses. So these could be other types of things. Travel, accommodations could be on this. There could be a list of items. I only listed one item here, but you could have multiple items. It depends on what's here. You add those up, and then a profit line. Sometimes you can add profit lines, sometimes you can't. On government projects, there's usually an allocated profit of up to 7% that you can have in all sorts of scenarios, whether it's a government grant for-profits or some other things as well. So you can have a profit line. In construction, it's somewhere around there too. Sometimes it's a little tighter. Other types of things, it can be higher. Then you get a total cost estimate, $18,922. Completed by, and then somebody else approved it, and what's the date? Great. So this could be your budget estimate. Typically, this would be an internal estimate, something that you could show to management, all those types of things. And usually they're involved in the process, particularly for the approval piece, because you want to show that you've put in some profits and you have made some contingencies. Now, would this ever be used in a quote? Could be, sometimes, as long as it's acceptable and is normal practice in that type of industry. Again, like the government, when you have certain things, they expect to see a profit line and probably some contingency planning, particularly if it's high risk. Some customers really balk at these types of things to have it in. So there may be some industries where you don't put those things. You embed those percentages actually within the costs. So it really depends upon the project and the type, something you want to be aware of. So if it's something where they want it completely transparent, great. You just got to be ready to understand that contingencies are in there. If it's somebody who doesn't want to see that, and they want to see the bottom line, they don't want to know about contingencies because it's going to turn them off, just embed it in the numbers. So, okay. So that's really the last piece of a budget estimate where you're putting it all together. So thank you for your time. And by the way, you'll be putting one of these in the group project component as well. So I'm glad you joined me, and I will see you in class. Take care.